If you followed my channel for a long time, you might remember that I started like 2 years ago a capsule wardrobe from 1882. Today, we're going to continue that, and I'm also going to explain a little bit about Victorian fashion etiquette that was in the natural form era and how you would dress for different occasions. Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making natural form era evening bodices. In the Victorian era, if you were rich enough, you basically had a different outfit for every single different activity. But even though there were different outfits for different things, there is a lot of overlap between the different styles, what is worn when, but the clearest cut that there was between day outfits and evening wear. And though we talk about day wear and evening wear, that doesn't actually necessarily always mean the time of day. Usually the more typical association with it is that day wear is something that you wear that is supposed to be seen in natural light, whereas evening wear is something that is shown in artificial light. So of course after dark, but also in other occasions when, for instance, you are at a party where you are indoors and the curtains aren't open, when it is assumed that you will be seen in indoor evening light, gaslight, then it was assumed that you would wear evening wear. Generally speaking, day wear is less formal than evening wear, but there are some exceptions. For instance, bridal wear most likely was usually day wear because it was very typical to get married during the daytime, and weddings weren't as big, lavish affairs as they are nowadays. It was usually just the bride and groom actually getting married, the wedding ceremony, and then maybe a little coffee or a small luncheon afterwards. And then the bride and groom would leave for their honeymoon. But overall, during the daytime in day wear, you wouldn't show as much skin as was appropriate for evening wear. In daytime bodices, unless we're talking about summer bodices, you typically wouldn't show any arm. This, of course, is a daytime bodice that I'm wearing, but because this is definitely summer wear, it is okay to show your arm. And if I was wearing this further into the fall, like right now, going outside, I would definitely have my arms covered. Again, of course, if it was sunny, then most likely I would have my arms covered too, because you don't want to show a tan, because if you get a tan, that means that you are doing manual labor, and that means that you are looking like you are lower class than you actually are. And in the Victorian era, we have to remember that these fashion rules about not looking like you work out in the sun is not only for the elite, the upper classes. Middle class definitely would have followed these rules too. If you weren't actually a homesteader with a farm, you would most likely try to avoid the sun as much as you could, and even homesteaders to a certain degree would try to avoid the sun. Of course, not so much that it would impede their actual work. And necklines were typically much higher during the daytime. You do see some more formal daytime bodices and summertime bodices that have a larger neckline. Usually that would be, though, covered with some sort of fichu or a chemisette or something to fluff that up, unless we are talking about an event where it is clearly in the afternoon and you are not going to be exposed to the sun. So with necklines, the general rule of thumb is that before noon, you are covered up to your neck, and then in the afternoon, you can have some bosom visible, but no actual cleavage. And then in the evening time, once the sun has set, you can show cleavage. But the ample amounts of cleavage were very much reserved for the most formal occasions. So in evening gowns, not all evening gowns could have huge amounts of cleavage or sleeveless styles. Sleeveless styles and huge amounts of cleavage were very much reserved for soiree gowns, ball gowns, and opera gowns. Of these, the opera gowns are the most formal, the most elaborate. You could also wear a ball gown to an opera. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're all separate garments if you can't afford that, because there were definitely a lot of people who were going out in society who didn't necessarily have the same amount of silly money as some of the other people going out in society did. So one way to elevate this gown would be definitely jewelry and your accessories. For instance, for a ball, you would definitely wear big diamonds and other big gemstones and show flashy jewelry. Whereas to an opera, you could even put a ton of feathers in your hair, and you definitely not go with just your hair dressed, that means styled beautifully. You would definitely have accessories in your hair. As far as what was appropriate for operas, there is some variation, and there is very much not consensus amongst different etiquette manuals. Some etiquette manuals say that you would definitely not go to the opera with your arms showing. Some say that that was completely fine. And also, what is arms showing technically also varies, because sometimes it means that you have to have an actual sleeve, be it lace or chiffon or something there. And some just say that basically wearing a long glove that covers up your arm is basically the same as a sleeve. So, as far as I can make out, there seems to be not real clear consensus as to what is appropriate for these different occasions. I guess it's one of those things that, like, if we look at modern day etiquette manuals, it's not like not everybody has the same idea as what is appropriate. There will be definite like discourse amongst people that what is that appropriate for that occasion, and was that appropriate or not. And it's same is true for the Victorians, especially the older generations who tended to be more conservative in their dressing, and younger generations, again, like today, used to break their rules because, like, people don't change much. Victorians weren't all that different from us, anyways. And a less formal category of evening wear would be dresses that you would wear for a dinner party, or just regular party, or going to the theater, or other sorts of social gatherings that happened in the evening time or happened during the day inside, where you would be seen in indoor lighting. And this category of dress definitely had more decollage showing than your regular day wear, and definitely they could have a lot of illusion sleeves, but you did have a sleeve that was usually typically elbow length. You wouldn't wear short sleeves or no sleeves for this kind of occasions. And though the neckline was much more open than in the daytime, it could be wider, it could show more chest area in general, but it wouldn't typically have a lot of cleavage visible. Chiffon and different sort of things to fill out that neckline was always typical in evening wear, not necessary, but it could be seen very often. In this sort of category of dinner evening wear, it was even more typical to have some sort of lace covering up that and filling up that neckline. Though, of course, lace, well, to our eyes, it might not actually be filling it out because you can still see skin from underneath, but to them, that was considered filled up. And this was especially true if you had a daytime function but that required evening wear. Then, again, you would be more inclined to fill in that gap. And as far as jewelry goes, it depended again a lot on the situation, how formal the event was. But in general, it's considered in good practice to not wear gemstones during the daytime hours. And then you wouldn't necessarily, for a regular dinner party, you wouldn't wear your hair full of like artificial flowers or jewels. But you could have bows and things like that, and you could definitely have your hair elaborately styled. And a very common practice amongst both elite women and women that didn't have quite so much money but that went out a lot was to have garments that were basically one outfit but that had multiple bodices to it, so that you could mix and match and you could wear the same outfit many times without it looking dated, without it being clearly visible that everybody has seen this already, and for different occasions. So that's why I'm making now two bodices, that one is more appropriate for dinner wear and one is a clear ball gown. So these would be two different levels of formality, but that they work with the same overskirt and underskirt so that they make a cohesive wardrobe. And this practice was not only recommended by ladies' magazines, but also you can find existing museum examples of this throughout the Victorian era. All these different patterns that I'll be using come from The Fashions of the Gilded Age by Frances Grimble. I'll link the book in the description, and I'll add page numbers for each of the patterns that I used also in the description. And because this is a part of my capsule wardrobe from 1882, these outfits are obviously also from 1882, but I'm going to be using the same underskirt. And when I talk about underskirt, I mean the visible skirt, not a petticoat. Though I am going to be using the same petticoat too. But I'm going to be using the same underskirt as I did for my daywear bodice and overskirt. But I'm going to be making a new overskirt because I'm going to be using the black taffeta that I made the underskirt from for both the overskirt and both of the bodices. Also, the overskirt drapery for my day gown is definitely not formal enough or fancy enough for evening wear. That is clearly something that is for day wear only. So I'm going to be making a much more formal and fancy overskirt drapery that is going to have much more drapery to it, and it's also going to have beading, as is my dinner bodice. The ball gown bodice is not going to have beading because the dramatic cut of by itself is so much of a statement piece that it doesn't necessarily need anything. And this is again another thing that is very common in Victorian era evening gowns. You can see very simple styles at very high levels of formality, and you can see much more elaborate in lower levels of formality, and vice versa. That doesn't necessarily tell you the level of formality, that how much details there is to a piece. Because a big part of it is also personal style, and Victorians, though there was very much a push to be fashionable, they very much considered also personal style of the wearer. So you could have very elaborate, very feminine trimmings with a bunch of bows and ribbons and lots of color exploding all over the place, if that was your personal style and your preference. Or you could have very simplistic, minimalistic things if that was more what you vibed with. So there was no clear definition that you have to do this. You could find your own style within the fashion. Another important consideration with evening dress is color. Because of artificial light, you needed to remember to make sure that things, especially things like dinner bodices, things that could be also seen sometimes during the daytime, that those would work both in indoor and outdoor lighting. So it was very much recommended that when you buy fabric for something, before you actually buy it, you take a little sample and test it out in both lights and against your skin to make sure that it looks good on you in both lights. Because of the harsh artificial yellow lighting, it is said that especially in the opera where the lighting is very bright, blue and yellow should be avoided because those tend to not look well in artificial lighting. They tend to get muddied and look kind of weird as colors. Especially recommended colors for evening wear are black, dark blue, dark green, garnet, fawn, brown, and of course neutrals. It is said that basically you need to discover what looks good on both you and what looks good in the artificial lighting. And on that note, yes, black was definitely worn for regular evening wear. Black was kind of like it is today, the standard color of, well, if you aren't sure, go with black. Not just for morning wear. Morning wear black is very much, especially for first morning, is very much those matte blacks. Any sort of fabric that doesn't have any sort of proper sheen to it, that would be considered appropriate for morning. And in first morning, it was not really considered appropriate to go to social events that would require evening wear in the first place. You could maybe later on go to a dinner party, but you definitely wouldn't be going to a ball while you're still in first morning. Then later on, when you are in later stages of morning, or if the relative or person who died wasn't so close so that you don't go in for the first mourning, then yes, you would most likely show up to different sort of social functions. But then by the time you get to second mourning, you're not only wearing black is an option, but also more popularly, you would be wearing lilac and different shades of gray. But despite the very strict rules around mourning, you can't necessarily tell always by looking at a garment that was this intended for mourning wear, because a lot of times, especially when we get to the second mourning, it very much depends on the accessories and how you are wearing it, not just the garment itself. But the garments I'm making now are very clearly not mourning garments. They are just beautiful black evening wear. And if you want to research more about mourning wear, keep in mind that during the Victorian era, the rules around mourning change very much from different time period to different time period. So the rules that apply to the 1850s, for instance, do not necessarily apply to the 1870s or 1880s. But even though we tend to think that it's sort of odd that Victorians had all these different outfits for all these different occasions, I still think we kind of do this. It's just that ours is less formal, and, well, our clothing in general is less formal than in the Victorian era. And I think we just, as a society, are less aware of it. But, like, you wouldn't go in the same outfit as you go to work out. Or in the same outfit that you go to work out, you wouldn't go to a fancy dinner. And you wouldn't wear that fancy dinner outfit for a casual family dinner, necessarily. And you'd wear a different outfit than any of these other outfits if you're going out clubbing. Let me know down below in the comments, what do you think of this? Do you still do this? Or do you wear basically the same outfit for all the occasions? I'd love to know. And if you've enjoyed this up till now, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this universe. And now let's get to the actual making of the garments.
Patterns in this book come in two types. One is scaled patterns with rulers that you scale up to your exact measurements. And the other ones are a single so-called standard size that you can then modify to your exact size. The patterns I'm using are the latter, so I scanned them on my scanner and then scaled them up to the correct size and printed them out in poster mode. And then I did the changes to the pattern pieces, mostly adding things to the center front because I'm much larger busted than these are. And sewed mock-ups to try on the bodices. And here's the mock-up of the dinner bodice. I'm going to be using this fabric as my lining because it is close enough. There is some excess at the center back. The only real changes I need to make is that the waist is slightly big all the way around, so I need to take it in at those points a little bit. But other than that, all that small wrinkling that you see is basically me having pinned it unevenly. So I don't need to do any actual changes to that. This is all going to be just small minor tweaks, so I can just cut it out as it is. And to get ready to bead the fronts of the dinner bodice, I used ginormous basting stitches to attach the lining to the fashion fabric. I drew out the beading design onto the pattern piece to make sure that everything fits correctly, and then I trace it on to the actual fashion fabric through tracing paper. The way I work the beading is that I take several beads at a time onto the needle and then push them down and then sew them onto the fabric in the correct angle and go through the beads again to secure them in place properly. And because I'm not bothered by the historical accuracy of all the insides, I'm going to serge the other pieces together. This will both finish the edges and keep the fashion fabric and lining fabric together. And then the bodice gets sewn up, and the seam allowances get clipped to allow the bodice to lay smoothly. While the other edges of the bodice are turned and hand hemmed, the neckline is faced with bias binding. The lace sleeves are sewn up by machine and attached to the bodice by hand. I used a back stitch for extra security. And hemmed down the seam allowance for a neat finish. And the buttonholes are sewn with a decorative buttonhole stitch to add more interest to them. And lastly, boning is added to all the seams that need it to lay flat. I'm using encased synthetic whalebone here, but you can use whatever boning you prefer, and you can use bias binding as your encasing if you don't have ready-made ones. As for the dinner bodice, unlike the day bodice, because it is so long all over my hips, this one did need to be in fact boned, but not completely. I boned the side seam and the first bust dart, and then I added a boning here at the back of the placket for the buttons. And next on to the ball gown bodice. This is again constructed like the evening gown bodice with all pieces flat-lined. On this, all the edges are folded over and sewn down by machine. And because this closes at the center back with lacing, a boning is added to the center back seams. My preferred boning is heavy-duty zip ties. Then I use an awl to push holes for the lacing. This makes sure that the fibers don't break, so the holes last longer. And then the holes are whip stitched around to secure them. Okay, here's the finished insides of the ball gown bodice. I added boning at the center front and at the sides and at one of the bust darts, because that was needed to be done so that it lies smoothly and doesn't wrinkle weirdly, and also because the point is so sharp in the front so that this stays at a nice angle and doesn't flop around. There needs to be boning in there. And then for the waist, I added this waist belt, and to give it something solid to be laced against, this waistband just helps stabilize that so that it is easier to lace up. It doesn't move about as much. And lastly comes the overskirt drapery. The pieces are cut, gathered, and pleated according to the instructions in the book, and then sewn together. And the seams are bound in bias binding to finish the raw edges. Then the overskirt pieces are pleated onto the waistband. And beading is added to the bottom front edges of the drapery. It's in a matching pattern to the neckline. And lastly, I add a hook and eye closure at the center front of the overskirt drapery waistband. And here's the finished ball gown ensemble. I finished off the ensemble with a small tiara, garnet jewelry, and mauve kid leather gloves, and a pair of satin embroidered evening boots. Mauve was one of the super popular synthetic aniline dyes. And here's the dinner bodice version of the ensemble. With this type of dinner bodices, gloves aren't always worn, but if they are worn, they are always taken off before you sit down to eat. And here are the two different styles for a side-by-side comparison. I'm really happy with how this project turned out and love the versatility of these pieces. And I feel like these styles, like most things natural form era, are very wearable in a modern day life. That's it for today. I'll leave you guys with a few more close-up shots of the gown so that you can see really the details. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye!